بعدك حبيبي يا ريت.
About the clinical practice and the clinical skills and the role in clinical decision making. Before, I have mentioned that medicine is a science of uncertainty and an art of probability. And the science forms or is the medical knowledge, and art of medicine is the medical practice. And we gain the art of medicine, or the art of practice of medicine, from experience and from understanding the wisdom of practice and the philosophy of medicine, and by the doctor having what we call the common sense in practice, because experience and common sense and understanding the philosophy of medicine are different from the medical knowledge or the sciences of medicine, whether the basic sciences or the clinical sciences, as just facts and evidence proved facts. So the knowledge is a part, medical knowledge is a part, medical science is a part, but the medical art or the art of practice is another issue. And I mentioned also that the under observation, that's to put the patient under observation and wait and see, is the art of medicine, is the art of medicine. And the role of the physician is to amuse the patient and take care of the patient till nature, until God cures the disease. Here I want to confirm on the fact that especially in chronic subacute or chronic cases, we have to be more conservative, and rather than in acute cases in which we have to be more aggressive and more energetic and more prompt in managing the case, because most of the acute cases might carry a life-threatening aspects, and so we have to be more aggressive in management of acute cases. But the art of practice and putting the patient under observation is actually more applicable in chronic or subacute cases, which in many of them we just need to put the patient under observation, gain information, and evaluate and interpret in order to, especially if the diagnosis is not clear, and still we have to gather more information from the symptoms, from the evolving physical signs, in order to reach to the final or definite diagnosis. Especially at the beginning, when we have what we call differential diagnosis, in which case we have many possibilities, and in order to reach to the most probable one, or to the definite diagnosis, we have to have time and to put the patient under observation. As I mentioned, look for the symptoms, look for the signs, and also wait for the investigations of the patient, the laboratory, the radiologic, the endoscopic, or the biopsies, or otherwise, and then we put our clinical perspective of diagnosis. So the art of medicine is to put the patient under observation. The art of medicine is to put the patient under observation. And there is a difference between the medical practice as a profession and the medicine as a science. As a profession, we have to understand the philosophy of practice. We have to understand the art of practice, and we have to be more thoughtful and to have what we call insightful thinking, to look into the case more deeply, and to try to understand it more clearly and more deeply. And this is what I have mentioned before while I was talking about thinking in clinical as a general basic clinical skill. And I mentioned that listening and thinking and observation is the classic triad of basic clinical skills. And the effective listening actually is very important. Effective, clear, active listening is an important and an integral part of effective communication. And the communication is a very important skill. The doctor patient communication and the physician or interphysician communication, especially when there is what we call a multidisciplinary approach, and there is a teamwork management of the case. Here, we have to have a communication. The doctors or the different specialists and or the different physicians managing that case should communicate together and should coordinate together in order to have a successful management of the case and to reach to the correct clinical decision about the case time by time, especially in cases which progress clinically, whether in the, for example, in acute cases in the ICU or in the ER, or chronic or more subacute or chronic cases in the medical or surgical ward, needing more than one specialty which work together to decide about what to do for the patient at every stage of evolution of the disease, because we know many diseases, they have natural history, whether acute situations or chronic situations, and in every stage of the disease or in every phase we might change or we might have a clinical perspective or clinical imagination about the case in that proper in that time or at that time. So all of these things need the proper thinking by the team, need listening skills to be implemented, need the observation skills which I mentioned before, and preparing adequate patient observation chart in the ER or in the medical ward, and this will be a very important part of the patient medical record, of course, generally as a part of his or her medical history, and in the on the long term and in the short term regarding the management of the patient in every time he or she enter the hospital or present to the doctor in his clinic, for example. So this is the implementation of the clinical skills in clinical practice, and we need to understand that the clinical process is a continuous process, and the clinical history of the patient is like a chain, and every point in time represent a ring in this chain, and we can't manage without knowing the or without involving the previous rings of the chain, and this current and the previous rings of the chain will also be needed in the future events or in the what we call the future prospects of the patient, and also in putting imagination and perspective about the prognosis of the case, and whether the patient prognosis is good or is bad or is poor. What are the prognostic signs? What are the poor prognostic signs? What are the good prognostic signs, which made us think that this condition is going to recover soon, or the patient has entered into an irreversible stage, or maybe even dying, or about to succumb to his or her disease. So this is very important, the clinical scales, and the incorporating them. And I mentioned also that the listening is important, and without listening and without history taking, the half of the diagnosis is lost, and maybe the whole diagnosis is lost. So there is no thorough clinical evaluation without history taking, and there is no thorough clinical evaluation without physical examination. So and I mentioned before that the history taking is important to gather subjective manifestations, that is symptoms, and physical examination or bedside examination is important to gather objective manifestations or signs of the disease. And the clinical picture is formed from both, from the symptoms which are obtained by history taking, and from the signs which are looked for and discovered on physical examination of the patient. And then from post the history taking, and that is listening to the patient, because history taking is listening. You are listening to the patient, and you are asking the patient, and he will answer you, and you listen to him without interruption, as I mentioned, and be patient to hear from the patient. Because if you didn't hear from the patient, number one, before you proceed to physical examination, if you didn't hear from the patient, or if the patient is unconscious or has disturbed awareness or disturbed consciousness, or has problem with his level or content of consciousness, as I mentioned before, the patient is comatose or in shock or whatever, you can get the information from the relatives of the patient, from his family, or from the attendees of the case. If the patient, for example, was found in the street or somewhere and then brought to the hospital from that place by some people, you have to listen to them. You have to understand if they know anything about the case, and how did they find him, and this is very important. So listening to the patient and to the attendees of the patient, the family or other people, is very important in the clinical interpretation of the case. And then we proceed to the physical examination after that, and then according to what we have gained as clinical information from the symptoms and signs, from the history taking and from the physical examination, we can tailor the what investigations are needed from or for the patient at that time, because the doctor actually should have the basis, the logical basis to decide about the investigations. And this decision about the investigations can only be tailored or decided according to the basic background clinical manifestations or clinical information, the symptoms and signs which the doctor have obtained by history taking and by physical examination. Because at every stage of the disease we decide, and then we escalate the investigations according to what is needed. Because the doctor is not free to do anything he want without basis, or she want without basis. As a clinician, he or she should have a basis to select these investigations at that time from that patient. And if he or she not able to be logic in selection of investigations and in tailoring investigations, sure, the clinician is not following the professional rules of the clinical practice, and maybe he will be also subject to